1897 Sicily, a land of dust, blood, and silence. In a forgotten mining town called Lercara Fritti, a boy named Salvatore Lucania entered the world. His father was a sulfur miner, a man who dug deep into the earth, coughing black smoke for pennies that barely kept his family alive. Poverty wasn't a condition here. It was a life sentence. Sicily, at the turn of the century, was no paradise. It was a land ruled by shadows. The mafia was not a myth whispered in alleys. It was the law of the land. A child like Salvatore grew up watching men with knives and guns settle debts faster than any court. Loyalty and silence, omerta, were carved into him before he even learned to write his own name. But the Lucania family wanted more than survival. They wanted escape. In 1907, desperation drove them onto a crowded steamship bound for America. Imagine it, weeks at sea, hundreds of immigrants crammed together, coughing, starving, clinging to the hope that the new world would offer something better. When they arrived, the Statue of Liberty didn't welcome them with open arms. It spat them out into Manhattan's Lower East Side, the filthiest, most dangerous corner of New York City. Here, dreams came to die. Tenement buildings stacked families like cattle. Rats crawled over sleeping children. Disease, hunger, and violence were daily visitors. And in this chaos, young Salvatore, now just another immigrant kid with nothing but a foreign name, learned the one lesson that would shape his entire life. In America, nobody gives you power. You take it. By the age of 10, he was already running with the street gangs. He wasn't the strongest, but he was the sharpest. Other kids fought for scraps. Salvatore figured out how to make scraps into an empire. For 5 cents, he'd guarantee no one would lay a hand on you. Protection money. At 10 years old, the business of fear was already in his blood. Lower East Side, New York City, 1910s. Imagine a neighborhood where every block had its own king. Gangs of Irish, Jews, Italians, all carving up the streets like wild dogs fighting for bones. For immigrants, survival wasn't about who you knew in City Hall. It was about who you knew on the corner. Salvatore Lucania, now a teenager, wasn't just another face in the crowd. He had something more dangerous than fists. He had brains. While other kids wasted themselves in knife fights, Salvatore made alliances. He was smart enough to see that the Irish weren't enemies. They were potential business partners. The Jews weren't rivals. They were investments. In a time when most gangs stuck to their own kind, Lucania was already thinking bigger. And this is where the streets gave him his first reputation. He ran with a gang called the 5 Points. Notorious even by New York standards, they didn't just rob drunks or shake down shopkeepers. They built networks, gambling, extortion, drugs, the real economy of the poor. And Salvatore, he was at the center of it, cold, calculating, fearless. But every legend needs a scar. And Salvatore got his early. One night, after a deal gone wrong, rival thugs jumped him. They beat him, stabbed him, and left him bleeding in the gutter. Doctors said he should have been dead, but he survived. That night, Salvatore Lucania was reborn with a new name. The streets called him Lucky Luciano. Not because he gambled well, not because he had charm, but because death itself had tried to collect and failed. From that moment on, Lucky wasn't just another gangster. He was untouchable. The kid from Sicily had transformed into something else, a man who would rise above street scraps and start building an empire. And while the world around him was gearing up for prohibition, Lucky Luciano was already sharpening his knives, waiting for history to hand him the greatest business opportunity in criminal history. January 1920, the United States declared war on alcohol. Overnight, beer, wine, whiskey, everything became illegal. The politicians promised morality. What they delivered was chaos. America was thirsty, and every glass poured was now worth its weight in gold. For the gangs of New York, it was like God himself had opened the gate to heaven. And Lucky Luciano, he saw the future. Where others saw street corners, he saw supply chains. Where others saw a bottle, he saw an empire. Lucky wasn't just a hustler. He was a strategist. While petty gangs scrambled to hijack trucks, Luciano partnered with the right people. He shook hands with Arnold Rothstein, the so-called brain of the Jewish mob. Rothstein wasn't a triggerman. He was Wall Street in a tailored suit. And he taught Lucky that real money wasn't in the fight. It was in the business. Together, they built an underground network that stretched from Canadian distilleries to speakeasies hidden behind barbershops and soda parlors. Whiskey flowed, and with it, so did cash. Millions upon millions. Luciano wasn't fighting for scraps anymore. He was sitting at the table with the city's power brokers. But it wasn't just about booze. Luciano was smart enough to understand loyalty had limits. He bribed cops, judges, and politicians so thoroughly that entire precincts answered to him. New York wasn't policed, it was owned. And Lucky wasn't just another gangster making money in prohibition. He was designing the blueprint of organized crime in America. While the newspapers painted him as a shadow in the alleys, the truth was far more sinister. Lucky Luciano was turning crime into an industry. And as the profits piled up, his vision grew clearer. The days of messy street wars were over. The future would belong to businessmen like him. By the late 1920s, Lucky Luciano was no longer just another hustler. He was rich, connected, and dangerous. But there was one problem: tradition. The old Sicilian bosses, men like Salvatore Toto d'Aquila and later Joe the Boss Masseria, they clung to the old ways. They believed in omerta, blood oaths, and absolute loyalty to Sicily. To them, America was just another battleground, not a business. Luciano saw it differently. He wasn't interested in kissing rings or bowing to ancient rules. He wanted efficiency, profit, structure. He wanted an American Mafia, modern, ruthless, and organized. The old guard saw him as reckless. He saw them as dinosaurs. This clash exploded in what became known as the Castellamarese War, a brutal civil war in the streets of New York. From 1930 to 1931, bullets rained down in Little Italy. Dozens of mobsters were gunned down in cafes, on sidewalks, even at funerals. Luciano played both sides like a chess master. Publicly, he was Masseria's loyal underboss. Privately, he kept lines open to Salvatore Maranzano, Masseria's rival. But Luciano wasn't fighting for either boss. He was fighting for himself. And when the time came, he made the move that would cement his rise. April 15th, 1931, a spring afternoon in Coney Island. Luciano invites Joe Masseria for a card game at a small restaurant. They sit, they drink, they play. At some point, Luciano excuses himself to the bathroom. And that's when the hit squad walks in, shots crackle. By the time Luciano returns, Masseria is slumped over the table, a revolver in his lifeless hand. The old boss was gone, and Luciano had just betrayed the Sicilian code, killing his own boss. But in doing so, he opened the door to his own empire. That day, Lucky Luciano proved he wasn't bound by the old rules. He was rewriting them. With Masseria dead, Luciano switched sides and joined forces with Maranzano. But even that was just another step in his plan, because Lucky knew, in this world, alliances are temporary, power is forever. By 1931, Salvatore Maranzano had declared himself the boss of bosses, a feudal lord in a modern city. But Lucky Luciano wasn't built to kneel. He saw Maranzano's ambition not as strength, but as weakness, a dictator doomed to fall. On a September afternoon, Luciano's men walked into Maranzano's office, disguised as federal agents. They carried no badges, only guns and cold intent. Within minutes, the so-called king was reduced to a bloody corpse on his own desk. But Luciano wasn't satisfied with just removing a tyrant. He rewrote the rules. He formed the Commission, a board of equals, where the most powerful bosses shared power, settled disputes, and kept the money flowing. No more single rulers, no more unnecessary wars. It was the birth of the American Mafia as an empire, efficient, organized, and unstoppable. With Maranzano gone, Luciano was untouchable. The commission kept the peace, but Lucky kept the money flowing. He was no street thug. He was a CEO of crime. Gambling, narcotics, nightclubs, prostitution rings, all connected, all profitable. Politicians looked the other way. Judges could be bought, and cops knew better than to interfere. Luciano wasn't hiding in shadows. He dined at the finest restaurants, mingled with movie stars, and shook hands with senators. To the public, he was a charming man in a tailored suit. To his enemies, he was a ghost with a knife. And to the underworld, he was the boss of a new era, the man who turned chaos into order and crime into business. But even Lucky Luciano couldn't stay untouchable forever. In 1936, a young, ambitious prosecutor named Thomas Dewey made Luciano public enemy number one. The charge? Running the largest prostitution ring in American history. It was more than a trial. It was theater. Dewey paraded dozens of women, witnesses who swore Luciano controlled every brothel in Manhattan. But behind the curtains, there were whispers. Some said these witnesses had been pressured, threatened, even promised immunity in exchange for pointing their fingers at Lucky. Others believed Dewey was less interested in justice and more in building his own political empire. The press went wild. Headlines screamed of a gangster king ruling the city's flesh trade. Politicians demanded blood. America wanted a villain, and Dewey handed them one on a silver platter. And yet, Luciano, he sat in court like a man at a show, impeccably dressed, cigarette in hand, smirking at the chaos. But the curtain fell hard. The jury found him guilty, 30 to 50 years in prison. The King of New York was caged. Some say it was justice, others call it the biggest frame-up in American history. Either way, Luciano's empire had been cracked, but not broken. Luciano was locked away, but America was at war. World War II raged, and German U-boats prowled the Atlantic, sinking supply ships, threatening the very lifeline of the nation. And then, sabotage, fires and explosions on the New York docks. The U.S. Navy was desperate. They needed control over the waterfront, eyes and ears inside the Union's protection against enemy agents. But the docks belonged to the mob, and no one commanded more respect there than Charles Lucky Luciano. In a twist no one could have scripted, federal agents approached the very man they had condemned. The deal was simple, almost surreal. In exchange for cooperation, Luciano would be granted privileges and, eventually, freedom. From behind prison walls, Lucky moved his pieces. Orders went out, and like clockwork, the chaos on the docks vanished. The Mafia policed the waterfront better than the Navy ever could, and in 1945, as the war ended, Luciano's sentence was commuted. He was released not as a free American, but deported to Italy. Once again, Luciano had turned the system on its head. From convict to wartime patriot, from prisoner to power broker. He hadn't just survived the fall. He had rewritten the rules of the game. Freedom had a price. In 1946, Lucky Luciano was deported to Italy, stripped of his American empire, forced into exile. But Lucky was no man to fade into obscurity. In Naples and Sicily, he reconnected with old mafia families, forging alliances that spanned continents. Europe was rebuilding from the ashes of war, and with it came opportunity. The black markets were thriving, ports were crawling with desperate men, and heroin became the new currency of power. Luciano, the eternal strategist, saw what others missed. He turned exile into empire. From Italy, he helped orchestrate the infamous French Connection, a narcotics pipeline stretching from poppy fields in the Middle East, refined in Marseille, and smuggled into the streets of New York. The very country that had banished him, now drowned in drugs, moved under his silent command. Luciano was no longer just an American mobster. He had become an architect of global crime, a shadow broker pulling strings from across the ocean. January 26, 1962, Naples Airport. Lucky Luciano, once the most powerful crime boss in America, collapsed from a massive heart attack. No gunfire, no ambush, just silence. Fate, claiming the man who had cheated death so many times before. He was 64, and yet his story didn't end there. Despite being deported years earlier, the U.S. government allowed his body to return to New York. And when the coffin arrived, thousands came. Gangsters in sharp suits, old friends, curious onlookers, all lining the streets. Some came to honor him. Others came to see the legend one last time. His funeral was one of the largest ever given to a mobster in America. Crowds spilled over the sidewalks as the procession moved through Queens. Luciano was buried at St. John's Cemetery, alongside other powerful mafia figures. For many, it was the closing of an era. For others, it was proof that his shadow would never fade. Lucky Luciano had started as a poor Sicilian boy in the slums of New York. He died a king in exile and was brought home like royalty. Even in death, he remained what he had always been, untouchable.